Shalom, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you. This is the first time we're meeting at 6 o'clock Texas time or 7 o'clock Eastern time, and we're making this a regular thing so that those people out on the East Coast can get to sleep in time. Uh, as you know, I tend to, well, I here comes another one. I tend to have this problem. I do a lot of bird walking, and I've told you before, bird walking for me is I find a little worm here or and there, and just like a worm runs across the yard looking for worms, I find myself doing the same thing. And so I've not changed my lesson, but I've added to my lesson that I'm going to share with you. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the world's first tilt, the mystical roots of idolatry. And the idea came to me from what we were working on Sunday morning. Now, before I really get started, I want to say Zechariah 13, which is where we really are, can be seen as a threefold process. We're going to be talking about purification, we're going to talk about separation, we're going to talk about refinement. In fact, the first verse, and maybe a little of the second verse, is called "The Fountain is Opened." So, in other words, cleansing from sin and idolatry begins, and it's the outer portion. It's not dealing with the inside. But then we go to false prophets and removing the impure teachings that have gone on for centuries. And that takes us to end of verse 6. Now that's about judgment of deceptive voices. It's about listening to the right people. And finally, we're going to go to talk about the remnant refined, and that's talking about the final trials, the emergence of the faithful ones. It's the transformation into, well, divine unity. Now, each stage is a deeper stage, from external impurities to false words, from false words, you get the concept. I want you to understand in verse 3, it begins by saying, or it ends by saying, "Thou shalt not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord," which matches up again with Deuteronomy 21, which is another verse which deals with the rebellious son. And so I'm looking at this story and seeing this a very similar kind of story. I'm going the more I study, the greater the question I have, and the deeper I find myself going into a Jewish teaching. And I'm going there to look to find the hidden text. So one of those areas of idolatry, or one of those areas is idolatry, and idolatry from a rabbinic point of view, well, like most things in Judaism, it's a very narrow area. You either do or you don't. But is that true for the Gentile? Are we under the same standard as the Jew? That's the question that I came up with. And what started me on this area was found in the book of Genesis, because Genesis is a seed plot, and it's in the chapter 25, and it begins with the first 5 verses of chapter 25. So let me again spend some time reading it to you, because this is the story of Keturah, actually, because in verse 1 it says Abraham proceeded to took a wife, and notice the word is wife, whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Nidan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Now Yokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the children of Dedan were Asherim and Letishim and Lemonim. And the children of Midian, and we go through that list, but I want to look at verse number 6. But to the concubine children. Now in verse 5, he gave everything he had to Isaac. Now he gives it to the concubine children. But wait a second. Why are they concubine children? Why are they not just his children? Obviously, he married a Keturah, so therefore these are not illegitimate children, and they're not half children. They're basically his. But it goes on to say, as we look at this, it goes on to say the children who Abraham's gave gifts, and then he sent them away from Isaac, his son, while he was still alive, eastward towards the land of the east. That's where he sent them. Idolatry didn't start in the beginning of the scriptures. In fact, it's not until Genesis chapter 5, verse 6 to 8 that we actually find a character. And this character we find is not because of it being written into the scriptures, but it's because of the Midrashic writings. But according to the book of Joshua, the world was becoming heavily populated during the days of Enosh. Now, Enosh was the grandson of Adam. And there's very little mention made of Esau or Enosh in the Torah. Most of what we know about him and his times in the Midrashic and Talmudic stories, well, they're basically just understandings. Now, mind you, the description is rather ambiguous and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And to Seth, also a son was born. Now, his name was Enosh, but this is where I find my struggles. And it's not mine, it's actually the rabbis and the commentators, because it says, then Uchal, which means to call by name. He called by name the Lord. So I used that word Hukal because it was really untranslatable. It didn't, it did it deliberately, but it's not entirely clear what the word means. In fact, there are at least 3 opinions that I've read that I take to heart. First one was Rashi, because Rashi held that the word Hukal comes from the Hebrew word kol, which means to profane, making a sentence read. Then he became profaned to call by the name of the Lord. So in the times of Enosh, people began associating the name of God with things other than God, namely idols or other people. And as a result, the name of God just became profaned. Now, Ibn Ezra believed Hukal comes from the Hebrew word hishkel, which means to begin, which would have made the sentence, then people began to call in the name of the Lord. Now, it was in the times of Enosh that people began in engaging in a practice of prayer, calling out the name of God. Now, previously, people had not believed that prayer was even effective or necessary. If God had made up his mind, there was no way that you were going to change it. And this changed in the days of Enosh, and the people began to pray. Now, Sephorno, he looked at this same word, Hukol, and he begins to ask the question. It's got a negative connotation to it. And he reads it, then, and he inserts the righteous, began to preach in the name of the Lord. So until the times of Enosh, there was no need to preach about God. Everyone already was aware of his presence and his power. And it was in the days of Enosh that his knowledge diminished. And it became necessary for those in the know to preach about his existence. Now, that's, it's as far as the Torah will go with this. But from here, I simply started going to the Midrashic teachings and coming up with my own understanding. And hopefully you understand that my understanding is fairly accurate. So the people began calling on angels, and they called on natural forces instead of God. These spiritual alignments stabilized the elements. Water surged, and the ground was largely covered by water. You see, this weakens creation structure. Later generations deepened this corruption, and by the time of Noah, God had reached the end of his forgiveness, leaving to the final and complete collapses of the world. Now, although the straight reading of this verse is open to interpretation, the Midrashic tradition it's pretty emphatic. Idolatry began in the times of Enosh. Rambam, also known as Maimonides, in his introduction to the laws concerning idolatry, he wrote this: during the times of Enosh, mankind made a great mistake. And the wise men of the generation gave thoughtlessness counsel. Enosh himself was one of those who erred. Their mistake was as follows. They said that God created stars and spheres with which to control the world, and he placed them in the high and treated them with honor, making them the servants who minister before him. Accordingly, it is fitting to praise and to glorify them and to treat them with honor. So they perceived this to be the will of God, blessed be he, and they magnified and honored those who he magnified and honored, just as the king desires that the servants who stand before him honor him. Indeed, in doing so is an expression of honor to the king. Now, after conceiving this notion, they began to construct temples, not to God, but to the stars, and to honor and sacrifice to them. They would praise, they would glorify them with words and prostrate themselves before them, because by doing so, they would, according to their false conceptions, be fulfilling the will of God. Now, this was the essence of the worship of false gods, and this was the rationale of those who worshiped them. They would not say that there is no other God except for this star. Now, ironically, idolatry originally had some sort of holy intention. People thought that such practices were honoring. Rambam continued to describe how these mistakes led to an all-out idol worship and how the existence of God was completely forgotten from the earth, save for a few righteous individuals. Was Enosh and himself a part of this movement, or was he merely one of the people who was at this time? Maimonides says that he was. Others disagree. They say they cited a midrash which supported until this point the birth of Adam, Seth, and Enosh, man created in the image and form of God. From this point on, the generations became corrupt and were created deformed. Now, by talking about the fact they were deformed, they also mentioned several other things that were happening on the earth at this point in time. 4 things, in fact, are mentioned. The first one was the fact that the mountains no longer were smooth, but became rocky. The deceased began to rot. People's faces became similar to those of apes. And lastly, people became susceptible to demons. So most people are aware of the great flood that took place with Noah, but actually there was a great flood before that. And that flood happened during the days of Enosh. And it was a result of punishment for the sins of that generation, because the waters simply overflowed and they flooded approximately a third of the world. Now, the Midrash sees this punishment as being tit for tat in direct response to all their idolatrous behavior. Now, this drastic event did not do much to hinder the advances of idolatry or its movement, and the world continued a steady decline. Terrible famines happened. The earth became less and less fertile. And it wasn't until the times of Noah, who was born in he was born 1056 after the creation of Adam, that the plow was first invented by Noah, which significantly eased the farming process. But God himself does not speak, or does speak, about idolatry. And I want you to listen to what he has to say. In fact, I've got 3 examples. Now, the first one comes from Exodus chapter 20, which is the chapter dealing with the 10 commandments. It begins by saying, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, the Hebrew word is el paneh, which can be interpreted upon my face or in my presence or even before me. But please understand, this doesn't mean forbid worship of another power. It simply means do not place intermediaries in place of me or between us. Now, the us is Israel, because it becomes obvious to that after we get to this next portion. Deuteronomy 4:19 says, for the revealing passage, that these God allowed or allotted to all the nations beneath the heavens. So God allotted the sun, the moon, the stars, those things which we call astral worship, were all given to the nations to perceive creation and be to work through them as an intermediary. Israel, however, was forbidden their route because Israel is called the direct relationship with the Ein Sof. The sages interpret that idolatry for Israel is not defined as idolatry for the nations, but it's separate, it's different. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17, idolatry is described for Israel. They sacrifice to demons, not to God. So here's the problem: is giving divine devotion to forces that do not find their source in the Ein Sof, in the great God. One more. Exodus 23:13 tells us, do not mention the names of other gods. Again, he's talking specifically to Israel. This means that they were not to invoke other powers as ultimate authorities. Is everything not centered on the Tetragrammaton, upon the four-letter name of God, when we consider idolatry? Now, I believe the answer is no, not necessarily. The Torah itself hints that God does not hold the nations to the same spiritual standard as Israel. Judaism teaches that there are three categories of monotheism. The first is called the worship of Ein Sof through his proper revelation, which is Israel. Secondly, there is a permissible intermediaries for the nations. Rambam and many of the Midrashim explain that God created spiritual forces, angels, heavenly bodies that channel his governance. The nations historically relate to these forces. This is not considered idolatry unless they treat the forces as being independent. And finally, the Talmud would say the Gentile may not set up an idol, but he is not commanded regarding their association, meaning associating God with intermediaries is not forbidden for the nations, even though it is forbidden for Israel. Because true idolatry is any system that denies the source, treats the creature as the creator, and involves demonic forces or destructive spiritual forces, and distorts moral order. We can get that example from those who worshipped Moloch, or from the sexual immorality that was happening in many of those days, or the blood cults, or, well, even today, including the teachings of Gaia, the mother of nature. These are all condemned universally. Now, in Kabbalah, idolatry isn't the same thing as another religion. Idolatry is in the most evil form, finds a person directing their soul's devotion to a power other than the Ein Sof. So think of Hindus who show devotion to aspects of the One, or Buddhists who define focuses on enlightenment. And what about Native Americans or natives in general who look for a focus on the source of life? Now, there's a group called Sofi, which are actually Islamic purists, and they hold to the idea of a single reality. Now, these systems aren't judged. They seem the same level as those of Moloch or Bel Peor or the Azazel. The Zohar first categorizes shades of white light, and second, the dark husks. So the Zohar stresses that God is the judge. If the heart seeks the king, even if the path is crooked, the king calls him precious. Whereas if the heart seeks the husk, even if the words are holy, it's idolatry. So as you can tell, the Torah's own language implies, well, nations are allowed to perceive God through intermediaries. Israel is not. This means that the Houthis and the Sufis are seeking God sincerely, and it's not idolatrous. God judges the nations primarily by their moral behavior, the 7 Noahide laws, and on their sincerity. Only explicit worship of evil or deification of created beings is considered true idolatry. The prophet Micah said, "For all the people walk each in the name of their God, but we walk in the name of Hashem, our God, forever." So this is not a condemnation, it's a recognition that the nations have their own paths. That's why there are so many religions in this world. The Rambam said in Halakot Melachim, which is the law of the kings and their ways, or in their wars, explicitly says the nations are acceptable before God if they keep moral law and seek him sincerely. What started me on this was this chapter 25, when we began to look, or when on Sunday we began to look at these sons. Abraham takes another wife, not a concubine. The sons of Abraham become concubines. So who really were Abraham's concubines if Keturah was his wife? I think what they were stressing was the fact that these people did not receive the same order. Now, on the surface, Abraham was ensuring that Isaac would remain his primary heir. So in Genesis 25:5, we read, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But in contrast, it says, but the sons of the concubines, he gave something. But it wasn't really a true inheritance, because you see, it was called gifts. Now, gifts in our mind are going to be tangible things. It's going to be wealth. It's going to be provisions or something. The rabbi saw something actually quite deeper. And according to Rashi and what he read in Genesis Rabbah 61:6 and Abraham and Sanhedrin 91a, the gifts were not ordinary goods. He gave them, and I quote, a name of impurity, mystical names that would provide them with knowledge or spiritual power associated with the forces which they call the Sitra Achra, or those forces of the other side. This means that Abraham, who had mastered all wisdom, both holy and profane, passed on esoteric knowledge, but not the name of his sacred covenant with Israel. He diverted certain powers of nature, astrology, and spiritual techniques eastward to prevent their misuse with the holy seed and with Israel. Now, midrashically, this is the origin of the Eastern mysticism. The sons of Keturah were said to have carried these mystical teachings into Arabia and the Far East, traditions that later evolved into a great Eastern mystical spiritual systems. Well, first, let me tell you, why is it called East? East has two meanings. The Hebrew word used here is kadem. Kadem can mean east. It's symbolic, or it's geographical. East of Canaan was Arabia and Mesopotamia and far beyond, and areas historically linked to Abraham's extended family. Symbolically, Kadem means also ancient, a place of primordial wisdom. It implies a return to the origins of knowledge, a pre-Adamic, pre-revelatory tradition. Mystically, in Kabbalah, the east, or to the right on the Sephirot tree, represents the realm of Chokmah, the dawn of light before the full revelation. Now, sending them eastward is like sending them toward the outer light, not a central flame that found in a covenant, but towards something else. Now, Abraham divided wisdom. The only covenantal light stayed with Isaac through Rebekah. The outer radiance of wisdom, natural, philosophical, or magical, That was given to Keturah's sons, and they were dispersed afterwards to the east. Now in the Zohar, Abraham's act preserved balance among the nations. Doesn't seem possible, but Abraham enabled or embodied Hesed. But I think he privately wished for his wisdom to bless the entire world, but he recognized that not all could receive it in holiness. So he channeled spiritual energies outward, where they would operate under the veil of their traditions until the days or the end of days, when all the streams would eventually come back and converge. Now, the sages identified these gifts not as physical objects, but as spiritual transmissions, specifically names, formulas, keys of spiritual practice. Now, the clearest tradition referenced is in Rashi, when he again quotes Sanhedrin 91a. He gave them Shmot Tamu, names of impurity. In other words, Abraham gave them certain spiritual names associated with mystical techniques, angelic names, occultic practices, and esoteric knowledge. These were not inherently evil, but potentially dangerous if they're going to be misused. So in Kabbalah, a Hashem, a name, isn't just a word, it's a pathway, and a pathway of social or spiritual energy, deep to the metaphysical force. And so Abraham passed to these sons the knowledge of certain spiritual names, how to work with the divine energies, how to engage spiritual forces, but without giving them the covenantal framework to channel them always correctly. So as the Zohar says in book 133b, Abraham was the master of all spiritual languages, holy and unholy. And he had to distribute the unholy names outward so that they would not remain near Israel. Now, you might be wondering what kind of names. Well, tradition speaks of names of tuma, impurity. These names these are not names of demons like in a horror movie, but rather the names of forces that operate outside of holiness. The name used by ancient Mid-Eastern or Eastern mystics, pro-magical formulas, spiritual technologies beyond those of the other side. Now, these are the roots of the magical traditions that appear later in Egypt, in Midian, and again in Eastern idolatry. Other names, Abraham's exported the dangerous knowledge so that Israel would again remain holy. Now, there's another tradition that says that the angelic names or the natural healing incantations or the astral wisdom or the proto-medical formulas, they all were not evil, but they were just outside the covenant. These names are connected to pre-Adamic traditions. And it's understood that Abraham was the last custodian of this wisdom, and he allocated different portions to different descendants. So why does the Bible speak of names as gifts? Well, I think it's because in ancient and mystical thought, they were to give a name, and it was to give access to a specific power. It's symbolic of a way, of pathway, an identity, a spiritual tool, well, or some sort of energetic technology. And why did he send them to the east? And again, because the east represents the domain of the rising sun, the realm of natural wisdom, a place where neutral, impure spiritual forces, well, they develop. Abraham is essentially performing what I would call cosmic tikkun, as holiness, Kedushah, stays center in the land of Israel. Now, the ambiguous, the powerful, the dangerous spiritual tools that are left behind went east. Now, it's important to recognize that the names of impurity were not, well, they were not evil like Melech. They were spiritual technologies. They were knowledge that was above and beyond. In fact, They become the roots of Eastern religions and occultic traditions and mystical practices outside of Israel. Mystical, these names, these gifts, became the basis of such things as the Magi, or the other word is Hebrew, is magus. And that a magus or a magi that was found in the New Testament is actually a priest of Zoroastrianism, an earlier Persian religion. Eastern meditation traditions, Arabian occultism, and, well, Midianite seers like Balaam, all of that was found here in this thing. Now, in the mystical and midrashic worlds, yes, the names and formulas Abraham gave to the sons of Keturah were understood as the spiritual seeds from which the early or the later Eastern religions and mystical systems emerged. I need to slow down. Let me take a drink of water. Because it's one of the more fascinating teachings in the entire Jewish esoteric traditions, Rashi, based on Sanhedrin 91a, says that Abraham gave them the names of impurity. These were pre-Adamic spiritual sciences. He goes on to say that in Genesis 6, where we learn about or 25, where we learn about the 6 sons of Keturah, he gives us their routes of migration from Arabia to Persia and all the way to India and beyond. Jewish tradition often links Mokshan, Dedan, and Arabia to the Indian Ocean as traders. Midian went to Arabia, to Egypt, to the Sinai. But Zimri and back to Yochanan, well, they're linked to the Proto-Eastern mysticism. Shua speaks of the land of Shua, or Aram. Now, the Near Eastern occult traditions, Midrashic geography, views these descendants as becoming the carriers of ancient spiritual wisdom, all the way to Japan, to China, all over the entire Far East. Kabbalistic traditions explicitly teach us that no single Eastern religion is said to come directly from Abraham, but the spiritual DNA can be traced right back to these 6 sons. In this sense, this is not doctrine, but these were spiritual tools that were formed in the earliest layers of Eastern religions. It obviously changed over time. Please understand, Abraham did not create Buddhism. He didn't create Hinduism, Taoism, or Shintoism. But mystical Judaism says he planted the proto-spiritual technologies that later cultures build upon. In other words, Abraham gave the children of Keturah the building blocks, and the nations later would build their skyscrapers upon them. But the skyscraper was not based upon the original design. The Zohar goes on to tell us when in Zohar book 1, 259b, and it's book 2 and 200a, that before Mashiach comes, the nations will return and the sparks of wisdom to Israel. So everything will come back together again, leaving here, returning then, which we will see in the next chapter of Zechariah. So realizing it came originally from Abraham, this doesn't mean religious conversions. It simply means recognition of a shared spiritual heritage. Okay. Were Abraham's transmitted names and formulas used to create Eastern religions? No, not directly. Abraham did not teach Buddhism or Hinduism. But indirectly, yes, the mystical raw material he gave them developed over centuries into what we now call the Eastern religions. Kabbalah explicitly teaches that the spiritual technologies they used originally came from Abraham. Okay, so let's go back to 13:3. So it happened when a man will prophesy prophesy falsely, I in the future, that his father and mother, those who bore him, will say to him, you should not live, for you have forsaken falsehood in the name of Hashem. And his father and his mother, those who bore him, will stab him when he prophesies. Sounds serious. Sounds deadly. But mystically, and I want to say that we can read the chapter 13 either in a plain, simple form, or you can go deeper into it to reach the level which I call sod. And so if we use the level of sod, the level of secrecy, we have to understand we're going to be talking about the son as being a lower self. In other words, it's an egotistic intellect that imitates prophecy, but is not aligned with the Ruach HaKodesh, not aligned with the Holy Spirit. Again, the father and the mother, well, they could be his father and mother, but they can also be what was known as Abba, which is wisdom, which is Chokmah. Or it can be Ima, which is understanding, and Bina, with the soul, which reclaim the wayward sparks. Now, the piercing occurs at this moment when the false speech is cut out or cut off. And when the divine reclaims his purity, well, thus verse 3 isn't punishment. It's tikkun. It's the chance to return. It's the severing of false prophecy from the sacred name, just as a surgeon removes cancer or some form of corruption that would be found in a human body. Now then comes the startling shift. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd. Smite the shepherd, and you shall be scattered. Now this line echoes both Moses's, the story of the shepherd of Israel, and the messianic figure later interpreted as the righteous one who suffers for the nation. In mystical terms, the shepherd symbolizes what's called tefret, or beauty, or balance. And the divine son, well, he's the center of this whole thing. He is the uniting of heaven and earth. So after the false sons are slain, even the true shepherd, the Zadok, is struck. And not for sin, but to absorb and transform the world's dissonance. Now this marks the transition from judgment regarding deception to the purification of truth itself through sacrifice and refinement. Finally, I bring the third part through the fire, and I will refine them as silver is refined. Now we know in a literal sense, we could be talking about 2/3 of the world dying and 1/3 surviving, or we could be talking about something else, because it talks about the wounds between his hands. Now, some Bibles use the word between his arms. It's a strange Hebrew phrase. Now, some texts, again, speak of arms, but the Hebrew word is yehedech. Yehedech is roughly translated hands of you. So Kabbalistically, hands corresponds to Hesed, which is kindness, that's the right hand, and Gevarah, which is judgment, that's the left hand. The left hand and the right hand of the Sephardic tree. So thus between the hands speaks of tefret, or a balance. So the heart, the wounds between the hands are the wounds to the heart of creation, symbolizing how false prophecy injures the very balance of the divine body. So the false prophet is stripped of illusions. And then therefore he confesses, I'm a man who tills the soil. Now at face value, the prophet is describing a future time when false prophecy will vanish, as it's going to talk about here in 2 through 6. Now during this time, a false prophet, when he confronts, or when confronted, he'll deny their calling. I'm not a prophet. I'm a farmer, a man who tills the soil. Now, literally, a worker of the ground, someone necessary or someone ordinary, tied to the earth rather than to the heavens. For the man has possessed me from my youth, meaning I was raised as a common man, not as a one who's called for divine inspiration. So in context, Zechariah envisions a post-prophetic age in which no one will claim divine authority falsely. The soil tiller symbolizes humility, someone who is grounded after the era of false spiritual pretentiousness. Now, throughout scriptures, tilling the soil carries the strong Adam image, humanity's conditions after Eden. Genesis 3:23. The Lord sent him forth from the garden to till the soil from which he was taken. To till the soil is to accept the human condition. He's limited temporally. He's laboring in a material world. So in Zechariah's vision, the false prophet confesses his humanity. I am Adam once more. I am of the dust. Now this line signals the return of some illusion or authenticity. The false prophet, well, he abandons spiritual arrogance and becomes simply Adam Hadamah, man of the earth. On the deepest level, tilling the soil alludes to the process of tikkun. It's repairing the world through grounding, divine light in matter. The soil, Adamah, represents Malkut, or the foundation, the base. The Shekinah, the representative, the feminine part of God, well, the world that receives the outflow comes from above. So to work the soil means to serve and raise sparks from the material world, to refine the cores, to resource the hidden divine vitality that's within. Now, thus, the verse becomes a kind of confession of tikkun. I am no longer the prophet of illusion. I am one who serves the divine presence through earthly labor. This is not a fall, but it's actually an elevation through humiliation or through humility. Now, it echoes the teachings of another Zohar book called Tikkun Zohar, that the true Tzaddik plants seeds in the Shekinah. His works in this world causes divine things to blossom. The Hebrew phrase, for man has possessed me from my youth, well, it can mean for a man acquired me from my youth, or mystically for Adam within me has guided me from the beginning. That is, well, the inner Adam, the early embedded soul. It has been, well, it's part of me since my youth. The speaker recognizes that true spirituality does not flee embodiment, but he abandons it. Now, with the link, this is the flow of Zechariah 13. I want to go through it again. I see something astonishing. Well, obviously, verse 1 was about the fountain, and it's about purification. And verse 2 to 4 was about falsehoods and prophecy. And it talks about cutting off. And verse 5 talks about humanity returns to the soil, a humble ground for creation. And finally, the ninth verse says that the refined remnant emerges purified like silver and gold. In other words, the farmer replaces the false prophet. Matter redeemed replaces illusions that had been exalted. We're watching man return to the simple service of humility. So in Lurianic terms, the false or the fallen sparks, well, they're humbled and reabsorbed into holiness through what they call betul, or self-nullification. So as I said before, symbolically, father and mother correspond to Chokmah, wisdom, and Binah, understanding, which reject the distortion of divine emanation through false channels. So thus, the supernal parents themselves, they're going to kill the impurity, not the son, meaning that the divine wisdom and the understanding cleanse the flow of creation. What Zechariah is speaking of is the death of distorted speech. When they pierce the false prophet, It means that the supernatural or the supernal intellect rejects their distortions, and the cosmos, well, it expels the untruth. And verse 7, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man who is my fellow. Smite the shepherd, and speak, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. This verse is, well, it's extraordinarily mysterious. It bridges the purification of Israel with the suffering of the righteous shepherd. Now, mystically, this being is known Kabbalistically as, he's called the cosmic shepherd, or the Sephirah Teferet, the balance. The shepherd represents the unification of divine mercy and judgment. The sword of awakening is Gevarah. Divine severity is turned even against the meditating aspect of divinity itself. It's the inner exile of the divine. Now, this verse alludes to the Shekinah's descent into the suffering of humanity and the shattering of the vessels that began in the early days, according to the Arizal. This metaphor, shepherd, becomes the inner drama of the divine presence, wounded in the exile of creation. Now, on a human level, the shepherd symbolizes the Zadok, the righteous leader through whom divine light flows. The smiting of the shepherd is the concealment of divine leadership before the final redemption, a stage where faith must be purified. In the Midrash, in a book called Yalkut Shimoni, and other later Kabbalistic works, we apply this to a man that they would call Mashiach ben Yosef, or the suffering Messiah, because he would be struck down before the final restoration and the arrival of the Mashiach ben David, the final king. Now, this seventh verse is this turning point, a lightning flash through the divine history. The sword speaks of divine severity, or the idea of Gevarah, judgment. And it draws upon the idea of the Hareb, a sword in Hebrew, and shares its root with the words of Harav, which means to make desolate. It represents the descending aspects of din, of judgment, divine judgment. To call awake, O sword, means that divine severity must act to cut away impurity, even at the cost of wounding the shepherd, the conduit that brings divine harmony. Now, the phrase, the man who is my fellow, well, is unique in all of the Tanakh. The man who is my fellow implies a being within the divine sphere that is not separate from God, but an emanation of God. And it would appear that God turns his sword against his own image, that is, against his image within creation, when he, in fact, it symbolizes what we call zimzum, or contraction, the self-limiting of divine light, so that the world can exist. Now, when Tiferet, the shepherd, is struck, the channels between higher and lower worlds breaks. Well, hence the sheep are scattered. This reflects the exile of the Shekinah and the dispersion of divine sparks across creation. But I will turn my hand against the little ones. Now, the hand symbolized active power. And the phrase means that the divine mercy will eventually regather these fragments. These little ones are the sparks themselves and the remnant souls destined for rectification. So in Zechariah 6 or 13, 7-9, we have a map of the process of how this works. The map is called by the Jews as a birth pangs of redemption. In 8 and 9, I will try to, it's quote, I will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God. Here the imagery of the rebellious son is inverted. The sons who once rebelled are now purified. Their speech, once false, has been healed, and now they call upon the name truthfully. The Father, Hokmah, represents they are my people. This is the moment of reconciliation. It's the return of the prodigal son to his divine parentage. So in our story, we moved from din, judgment, to rakamim, mercy. And again, you can go through the verses and you begin to check that out. But from harsh separation, the death of falseness, the sacred suffering speaks of the wounding of the shepherd. The union of voice and response speaks of the alignment with truth. This is a cosmic teshuvah, repentance, not as remorse, but as restoration of the divine word in its total harmony. Now, by 13:9, the entire pattern of the rebellious son is redeemed. So in Deuteronomy, the rebellious son dies and his voice is silenced. In Zechariah, the rebellious son, well, he dies only in the sense that his voice dies, but he can be reborn again in purity. Now, their speech, now aligned with divine will, becomes the vessel of the Shekinah's return. Thus, Messiah represents the perfected Son, in whom false voice is burned away, and the only true name remains. And he embodies Israel's purified, the Son who once rebelled, but now reflects his Father's light. Did you notice how in chapter 13, we begin with a fountain of water and we end with fire? The rebellious son, the false self, passes through both. He's first washed, then he's refined, until he emerges as a vessel that is truth. So this is the secret of resurrection. Destruction first, giving birth to a revelation. Zechariah 13 transforms the law of the rebellious son into the gospel of the redeemed son. We end in 13:9 when it says, and they will call my name and I will answer them. So the rebellious son becomes the prophetic son, the son of truth, born from the fire of judgment. So let's take this just one step further. I hope you can hang in there, showing how Zechariah 13 transforms the rebellious son and connects with Malachi's prophecy of in Elijah, turning the hearts of the fathers to the children. That's the prophetic closure of this whole theme, reconciliation of generations and heaven and earth. Now, we just traced in Zechariah 13 how it turns the death of the rebellious son into a refinement of the true son. Malachi 3:24 then completes the arc, not through death, but through reconciliation. Let me walk us through it carefully. And he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with utter destruction. Now, these are the final words of the prophets, the bridge between Tanakh and the future redemption. They stand as the tikkun, the redemption, or the general estrangement that's both literal and it's cosmic. In Zechariah 13, the parents' hands are instruments of judgment. They pierce the false son to restore truth. In Malachi, the hearts of parents and children are turned towards one another. Judgment is going to give way to mercy and reunion. Now, this reflects the mystical movement of Geverah, of separation and justice that comes through Hesed, or mercy. In other words, what was once accomplished by piercing in Zechariah is going to be accomplished by turning in Malachi. Now, I find it interesting that Malachi named Elijah as the prophet of reconciliation. Behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, Elijah's mystical role is that of the herald of Tikkun. So he bridges the lower and the upper worlds. He appears at every circumcision. He's the repairer of the covenant. between father and son, and he transforms zeal into what the Kabbalists would call the fire of Geburah, the compassion, the light of Hesed. Now, in essence, Elijah does for the hearts of Zechariah, sword and fire did what did for the land. He refines not by killing falsehood, but by transforming it through love. So thus Elijah is the completion of Zechariah's purification, that purification process of the fire that once consumed, not because of the light that will eventually reunite it. In the mystical body of Israel and within the human soul, these prophecies describe the reconstruction of our inner temple, our inner temple. In Zechariah, the outer idols and the false prophets in the outer courts, well, they're cleansed. In Malachi, the Holy of Holies, the heart is reconciled. And the Shekinah and the divine presence, which had withdrawn due to estrangement, returns and rests upon, well, like, once again, between the Father and the Son, Tefret, the truth and the justice, the Malkut of our foundation. For Israel, this is the end of exile in its truest sense, not merely the return to the land, but the return to intimacy. So here we learn they call upon the name of the Lord and I will answer them. Final phrase. The soul purified in a divine fire can receive and return. That's what's going on. Again, learn there were two parts that are going to be cut off and a third will be left, and I will bring that third through the fire. Now this means this is the mystical furnace of judgment that purifies each of us with truth. In Judaism, it is taught that there are 5 levels of one's soul. Here, Ezekiel is taking us through about 3 of the levels: the nephesh, which is our animal soul, which is our earthly drive, the ruach, which is our emotional and moral self, and the neshama, which is our divine intellect. The 2 parts cut off represent the nephesh and the ruach, still dominated by ego and illusion. But the third remains. That's the neshama, because it passes through the fire and brings radiance. In the book Shar Hagalim, the gate of, well, let me take it back. I have a couple people just came to class. Sorry about this. Anyway, in the book Shar Hagalim, which is the gate of reincarnation, the great Kabbalist Isaac Luria explains that each generation undergoes perfection until the sparks descend for the third part are clarified. Now, when Eliyahu in Job 33, 29 and 30 said, behold, God does all these twice or thrice within man to bring back his soul from the pit to be enlightened with the light of the life. So did you catch it? He believed that some may return 2 or 3 times before correcting for correction purposes. The fire is not meant to be external punishment, but it's meant to be the light of Binah, the light of understanding. He called an Ephish Echolet, which is a consuming fire, which burns away the klipot, the husk that surrounds our soul. They call on my name and I will answer them. Now this completes the full restoration of God's true name, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud-K Vav-K. So before this tikkun rectification, Hashem, the name was fragmented into Yud-K and Vav-K. Well, after the purification, the upper and lower halves will reunite, symbolizing what's called Yakud, which is oneness between heaven and earth. That's why the verse ends, I will say, it is my people, and I will say, Yud-He Vav-He is my God. This is the cosmic echo from the Song of Songs. Ani ladodi va-dodi li. I am my beloved is mine. This is the mystical song of a marriage that we're all going to see. Okay. I should never have taught this much because according to understandings in the brain, you can only absorb 8 new things. And I think I gave you more than 8. And for those who came late, I'm sorry, but they're now starting my lessons at 6 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock Eastern time. So yeah, hopefully you can get the copy of, or you can go to the website and get a copy. But anyway, I I hope you gained some of the information. But until the next time, when I will bless you with more of this kind of stuff, shalom, y'all. Have a great night.